Okay, right. Well, since it is 35, I will kick off proceedings. Welcome everyone to the final debate of the Fitzwilliam College Debating Society for this term. We are debating today the motion of this House believes the role of prisons is rehabilitation. And we have, of course, 4 speakers for that. The debate will work as usual. If you've been here before, we'll have 2 speeches first of 5 minutes each. We're not allowing any points of information now because it's very difficult on Zoom. So we'll have one proposition, and then one opposition speaker. Then we'll have questions, and then we'll have, after questions, we'll have the second proposition and then the second opposition. If possible, please can you direct all your questions into the chat on the Zoom chat. We're not going to do like click on you and allow you to speak, just because that makes it a bit more complicated, especially for the recording. So first of all, though, before we go into the debate, let's have a quick vote. If you can use the reactions on the side just with a thumbs up, that would be great. So for those all in favour of the motion that this House believes the role of prisons is rehabilitation, please can you put your thumbs up now?
Oh, wait.
We have some guidance now to do that for those of us that aren't especially skilled on Zoom.
As well. And can I also ask the 2 speakers, Jack and Jake, to mute yourselves, and then can then those against the motion that this House believes the role of prisons is rehabilitation put your thumbs up or react, please? Okay, and those in abstention. Okay, lovely. Brilliant. Okay, well, we'll get started. I now call upon the first proposition, Ola.
Okay, all right. Well, to begin with, the 4 main functions I found with prison sentencing are safety, retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation or reform. And I think it's appropriate to introduce my argument with the notion that eradicating crime, at least in a modern democracy like ours, is the ultimate aim of prison sentences. And I think rehabilitation is the most effective way of achieving this, and it's can be quite clearly illustrated through its ability to tackle the issue of reoffending prisoners, which is a major obstruction to the eradication of crime. And so for some context on the problem that is reoffence rates, say 2017, for example, around 42% of juvenile offenders and 29.5% of adult offenders reoffended, with the average number of reoffences per reoffender being around 4 for each. And going back further beyond this, in 2009, repeat offenders committed more than 500,000 offences in a year. And so I think it's quite clear that reoffending does constitute a significant portion of crime in the United Kingdom. And then moving forward to rehabilitation as the most effective way of solving this problem, I think this is quite evidently demonstrated when you take comparisons between countries such as Norway, which take a focus which is much more based on reformative justice and rehabilitation. And when you take countries such as America, which focus much more on the threat of deterrence, on deterrence and the threat of severe punishment. So in Norway, they have one of the lowest reoffending rates in the world, around just 20%, together with one of the lowest crime rates in the world, and also just under 4,000 prisoners, and the population is 5.5 million. And the tactics that they use are things such as open prisons, where you might not have security cameras, for example, have unarmed guards, and generally a much stronger relationship of trust and responsibility between the prisoners and the staff, and a general focus on rehabilitation. And if you put this in contrast with America, where there are much higher rates of reoffences, for example, in 2005, it's around 60%. They focus instead on deterrence and severe punishment. And there, the number of prisoners has quadrupled in the last 4 decades, as prison sentences have also been getting longer. And I think this shows that focusing on lengthy prison sentences And deterrence is neither working to prevent people from committing crimes in the first place, nor stopping prisoners from reoffending once they get out. And in contrast, a focus on rehabilitation should be taken because this is quite clearly more successful, as you've seen in Norway. And I think the contrast can be explained not just in these political terms of rehabilitation versus deterrence, for example. It can also be explained in the contrast between contextualism and libertarianism. And I think with contextualism being on the side of rehabilitation, I think this approach is much more appropriate and much more realistic because while we understand that there's a certain responsibility of prisoners, of individuals for their actions, so prisoners when they've committed crimes, that they deserve some form of retribution. We also appreciate the external factors which contribute towards the decisions to commit criminal offences. For example, we readily recognise the relationship between poverty and crime or drug addiction and crime. And a focus on rehabilitation is much more appreciative of these factors, whether the method of rehabilitation is by having methods of trying to reduce the amount of people that are relying on drugs, for example, or trying to combat poverty or educational problems. And so a focus on rehabilitation, yet much more appreciative of these factors and a much more constructive approach to tackling the ultimate goal of prison sentences, which is eradicating crime. And so I believe that the role of prisons should be rehabilitation. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you for that, Ola. And we now move straight to the first opposition speaker, Jake.
Hi. So I largely agree with Ola. I think that definitely the purpose of the justice system should be rehabilitation, but I don't believe that prisons are the most adequate way to perform rehabilitation. And it's quite an obvious truth when you think about it, because you're taking criminals and you're cutting them off from society. You're cutting them off from all of the things that cause them to perform crime in the first place. And sometimes you're doing that for a matter of years, where they become more entrenched within a criminal lifestyle or whatever. And then you put them back out into the normal society, the normal world, where with £46, our prisons give prisoners £46 to get by. And they suddenly have all of the temptations, all of the habits, all of the causes that caused them to commit crime in the first place back available to them, which they were cut off while in prison. And that's why our reoffending rates are so high. And inherently, prisons are, as Ola said, part of the prison has 4 functions. Safety is one of the main ones. And so prisons do serve a purpose in that when somebody is in actual danger to everybody else, they do need to be separated from society. For everybody else who commit crimes that, victimless crimes, for example, or crimes which have a very small effect on other people, they should not be sent to prison. They should be rehabilitated on the outside in normal society. And our justice system actually already understands this, because for crimes with a sentence of less than 4 years, you're let out halfway through, and you're under monitoring of social workers and the like, where they rehabilitate you back in normal society, where you can work and have a job and interact with your family, because positive validation is actually what causes people to be less likely to reoffend, rather than in prisons. It's inherently negative validation because of the retributive aspect of it, which is necessary in society for crimes where there are major victims. And so essentially, that's the point. Proposition says this fails to address the question. It doesn't, because the motion is the role of prisons is, the role of prisons should be rehabilitation. The inference from that is that the primary way to rehabilitate people should be prisons, right? And I'm arguing that there are better options. And actually, once there are better options, the role of prisons wouldn't be rehabilitation. It would be the other three functions of safety, retribution, and arguably deterrence, but prisons are bad at that. And then prisons would no longer be a rehabilitative force. So it completely answers the question. But I think second opposition will take a different stance. And Ola actually brought up drugs quite a lot, which I think is an important thing to discuss, because in the UK we basically have two ways to help drug addicts. We have rehab, which obviously is intended for rehabilitation, and we have things like the anonymous 12-step program. The anonymous, I don't have the stats, but I have looked them up before. The anonymous 12-step program is much more successful with getting people off of drugs. And that's because it teaches people not to use drugs through positive validation while they're living their normal day-to-day lives, where they can ring their dealer and get drugs whenever they want, but they learn not to. Rehab cuts you off, makes you go cold turkey, and then when you're back on the outside, you suddenly have access to drugs again, and it's much harder not to use them. I think that that's a perfect analogy for prison, because when you're on the inside of prison, you can't commit crime because inherently you don't have the means to commit crime. So you don't actually learn through experience not to perform it. And so, like, essentially, yeah, prisons are inherently bad at rehabilitation. And so they are insufficient in performing the role of rehabilitation. So the role of prisons shouldn't be rehabilitation, but rehabilitation is important in society.
Thank you for that, Jake. If you could mute yourself, thank you. So if audience members would like to send a question to the chat, please do. We have a load of questions already, if I can read them from here. So here's one question. Is there not an absurdity to the idea that prisons would be only rehabilitative? And I think this, of course, comes to Jake, I think. Jake, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so an absurdity to the idea that prisons can only be rehabilitative. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But I think Ola actually addressed that, because prisons do serve four purposes. The safety and retributive purposes of prisons, I would argue, are the primary ones. I would argue that in certain instances, prisons do need, certain people do need to be cut out of society because they're an actual danger and a threat to other people who are living their day-to-day lives. And in crimes where the victims are, where there's a very serious victim and the victim has a long-lasting impact of the crime performed upon them, retribution actually goes a long way in helping them recover. And so, yeah, it's absurd to say that prisons can only be rehabilitative. I would go further and say that prisons can't be rehabilitative even in part. But yeah, I would be interested in Ola's response, but I think he sort of responded to it.
Jack, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think asking that question, again, it fundamentally misconstrues what it is that we're actually asking this evening, which is not that prisons should only be aimed at rehabilitating, because quite plainly, I agree that is an absurd statement, because that, you won't always get that. But I think what the question asks more than anything is whether the aim of prisons should be to rehabilitate prisoners. And I find it quite hard to argue that, in fact, that shouldn't. Obviously, I'll explain a little bit more detail when I deliver my speech. But I think the question is flawed on its own premise, really.
I guess there's a question. There's another question here, which I think is probably more to the proposition and proposition around the issue of drugs. I know Ola mentioned this, but the question is, what do speakers think of the statistic that many prisoners do develop drug problems whilst in prison? Does Ola or Jack want to take that?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. So this touches on some of the things that I'm actually going to talk about in my speech now. And essentially, to summarise, it's just because those problems are evident in our prison system at the moment doesn't mean that it's symptomatic of an inherent problem within prison systems themselves, but more of the way that prison systems are currently being run. And I would postulate that that doesn't actually express the true potential of an ideal prison system. I think a lot of the decision-making that's gone into run in prisons in the last generation or so have led to a climate where those things are able to happen, aren't conducive to proper rehabilitation. But again, as I'll explain in a short while, there is the real potential, backed by evidence and plenty of literature, to suggest that prisons can and indeed should be rehabilitative arenas where prisoners come in and leave as hopefully, changed people.
Okay. Another question to the proposition. I'll let maybe Ola take this one. Jake, I'll come back to you.
Respond?
Maybe like later. Just I think we need to get through some of these questions before we can get back to speeches as well. This is to the proposition. Maybe Ola can take this one. While the question makes no reference to prisons being the main mechanism of rehabilitation, if there are other things that are more effective in rehabilitating criminals than prison, why should the main function of prisons be rehabilitation? Are you happy taking that?
Yeah, I think that does link rather heavily to my speech focus on reoffending, because if prisons were to neglect the aim of rehabilitation, even though there are other methods of achieving rehabilitation which are clear, because not all offences result in someone being sentenced to prison, while they do all tend to have a rehabilitative aspect of them. But going back to the point, even though there are other means of achieving rehabilitation, prisons certainly shouldn't neglect this, because what we get when prisons do neglect this is that there are high reoffence rates. And so for a lot of prisoners, it just leads to a cycle of crime. And so they certainly should focus on rehabilitation.
Also, just very quickly,
Jack,
just add in very quickly, so very quick, George. By the nature of your question, you sort of admit that those in prison are those that have the most problems. So surely those in prisons are, by definition, those most in need of an intervention to try and help change their character and form them into well-integrated members of society. So if they are in prison, then rehabilitate.
Right, okay. We're now going to move on to the next speeches. I don't think there's further questions at this moment. So we now move to the second.
Can I please confirm, considering they've just had like 3 speeches?
Yeah, Jack has. Okay, Jake, 1 minute, and I'm timing you.
So the proposition are conflating prisoners and criminals. Obviously, criminals do need help with rehabilitation. Prisoners don't. Yes, well, prisoners do, but that's because they're in prison. And he said that drugs in prison, etc., aren't an inherent aspect of prisons. They absolutely are, because most people commit crimes or take drugs because they know criminals or they know people who take drugs or give them access to drugs. When you put a bunch of criminals into one space, they talk, they influence each other. And so Ola talks about reoffending a lot, but most reoffending is actually in different crimes to what the criminals originally were put in prison for. And that's because of the influence of other prisoners. That's the entire point. The prisons cause reoffending inherently.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake. And we'll come back to you, of course, for more questions. There is plenty of time for questions, but we need to go back to the speeches, and we go to our second proposition, Jack. Jack?
Wonderful. So very, very quickly, I just want to lay the ground before I start. I think it's worth mentioning the social significance of this debate. And the way that we answer this question is reflective of our wider view of what society should be like. So starting off, I think it's a good idea to know what we mean by rehabilitating. And I think a good functional definition that we can start and agree on is encouraging and assisting people in leading a good and useful life. So practically speaking, that means that when someone leaves prison, we want their behaviour and attitude to have changed, and we want them to not reoffend. But ultimately, we look at moving from a pattern of offending and criminality towards a pattern of successful social integration. And again, that's supported massively in criminological literature. Kirkwood and McNeill write quite well on that in terms of what we want from it. I want to approach this from 2 perspectives. The first is a brief overview on how it stands at the moment in a factual perspective. But I want to spend more time on the normative aspect of why it should be that way, and the support and evidence and literature on that to show that it's not just a philosophical moot point, but is instead a desirable position that has actual social impacts. So firstly, when we look at the aims of the criminal justice system and we see what we want to achieve, essentially the aim of a sentence in criminal law is to repay a debt to society that's been incurred through criminality. So the idea being that once the sentence is over, we're back at equilibrium and that we can start again. So in this sense, you make a criminal a citizen again. And I think evidence of this is found quite plainly in the prison rules passed in 1999. Rule 3, which says purpose of prisons, this is the legislative definition of what prisons are for. Rule 3 is the purpose of training and treatment of convicted prisoners shall be to encourage and assist them to lead a good and useful life. So already we have, by statute and by legislative intent, a want and a purpose of rehabilitation. And that's supported further. Rule 4, an outside contact, says that prisoners should be encouraged to make contact with the outside world because that promotes the best interests of their own social rehabilitation, is quite what the Act says. So already what Jake says about prisoners being locked away all the time and there's no contact with the outside world is quite an outdated idea of what prisons are actually like. I will touch on that again later in terms of how we can rehabilitate. And again, education and library use is also specifically stated in the prison rules as something that should be pushed for prisoners to do because it has massive, massive social impacts. So that basically is the factual reality of where we're at with the purposes and rules of prisons, is that they are intended to be rehabilitative. But I want to talk a little bit now about why that hasn't necessarily been the case and how we can go about making it so that should happen, and more importantly, why. So secondly, the topic of desistance, which is reducing reoffending. We have to look at why it is that we send people to prison, and as Jake has actually touched, is about public protection. And I think though it's contestable that public protection can justify every imprisonment, if we work with it as a general principle, then we can see that if you want to protect the public, then reducing reoffending seems to be a basic, obvious way to do that. So if you want to protect the public, surely your criminal justice system should aim to have people that when they come out of it aren't going to reoffend again. And I think one of the problems we have with prisons at the moment is what a very good criminologist, Anthony Bottoms, has termed populist punitiveness, which is basically you have governments that appeal to a public notion of what a justice system should achieve, but you don't actually achieve long-term material goals of that. It's just political point scoring. And other academics such as Lacey in 2008 basically says that you need to depoliticize penal policy to be able to get social good from it and address the problem of expanding prisons, because it's no coincidence that you have an increase in prison population that's risen by around 70% in the last 30 years. There are more than 2.5 people get more than 10 years in prison in 2018 than did in 2006. So we have a perpetually swelling prison population. And this is because prisons aren't addressing their purpose properly. And the Prison Reform Trust wrote a report called the Bromley Briefings Fact Files. I would recommend anyone to read them because they lay it out in perfect, really good infographics, and the hard data is there. There's no link between prison population and levels of crime. So this punitive approach of not rehabilitating people in prisons just doesn't work. We've tried it. It doesn't work. We've stripped the money out of prisons so that they cannot... Left. How long, sorry?
5 seconds left.
Really? Okay, so basically hard data is, based on the 70s, when you gave jobs to people, there was a 46% reduction in reoffending. In the last 10 years, prisons have been stripped of the money to provide education, and this coincides with a rise in crime. When you provide opportunities for people upon leaving prison and you allow them to be educated, you allow them to take vocational work, the significance in reoffending is that there's a huge marked drop in it. By implication, when you rehabilitate in prisons, you create an optimum societal condition for prisoners so that you achieve your purpose of criminal justice.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to stop you now before I feel that you may keep going. Thank you for that, Jack. And we now move to our second opposition. There will be plenty of chance for Jack to answer questions and have more opportunity to speak later. But now we go to our second opposition, Sean.
Thank you. So you heard from Jake earlier how prisons aren't conducive to rehabilitation, regardless of what the current aim of them is. And if you're of the mind to focus on the rehabilitation element of them, then I can't really see an argument that might undermine that view. If you truly believe in rehabilitating all criminals, you can't support the existence of prisons, and so cannot support the idea that their role is rehabilitation. That said, there are of course those of us who believe that some prisoners simply can't be rehabilitated, or even that the primary purpose of prisons should be public safety and justice, a punitive role if you like. I cannot support the abolition of prisons for that very reason. There are simply some criminals, such as mass murderers or rapists, that cannot be rehabilitated. The general reoffending rate for convicted criminals in a Prison Reform Trust briefing in summer 2019 stood at 50% in the UK, which is higher than the 2017 number mentioned by Ola earlier, it seems. And the former Director General of the Prison Service, Sir Martin Neri, has gone on record to say that rehabilitation simply does not work. These are statements about prisoners in general, and Sir Neri has been clear that a move away from rehabilitation is not a move necessarily to an entirely punitive system. Indeed, he continues to argue for greater compassion and the improvement of standards within prisons. These are key elements of the Norwegian approach to the proposition earlier mentioned, but they are not rehabilitation by themselves. Their purpose doesn't need to be social reintegration, as Jack mentioned. Instead, Neri has urged us to recognise that comparatively short rehabilitative courses cannot remedy issues that extend often to an offender's childhood. Mark Leach, the editor of Prison Oracle, explicitly supported these comments, saying, "Expecting our prisons to reform those we throw into them from high crime inner city housing estates, their school exclusions, unemployment, poor opportunities, poor parenting, and where gangs, guns, drugs, alcohol, violence, and crime are embedded, is an impossible ask when the living experience in so many jails is one of disrespect and often abuse. It's like asking an A&E department to reduce accidents and then blaming the doctors when car crashes increase." If, like myself, you knew little of the ongoing debate around this very issue, and so have no idea who Mark Leach is, he's a former prisoner himself of 20 years in 50 different prisons, including at Wandsworth Prison, for example, a Category B or high security prison, and the author of a book on prisons in England and Wales, and a creator and editor of the site Prison Oracle that has over 10,000 members. So it's clear that individuals from all sides of the jail cell with highly respected opinions on this issue strongly oppose the idea of prisons having the role of rehabilitation, yet they do not call for the abolition of prisons. I've discussed so far only the most general arguments against prisons having the role of rehabilitation. You mentioned earlier the inability to reform particular types of prisoners, such as mass murderers or rapists. I wish to stress that this is of course not uniform. There have been cases where even the worst criminals appear to have truly and genuinely repented, become better people. But before they had reached that stage, they remained dangerous individuals. We do not have Category B and Category A prisons for amusement. We have them because some of the most dangerous men and women in this country need to be kept away from the public, unless they commit even more crimes. That might range from terrorists who are ideologically wedded to mass harm, to murderers who might have serious conditions that we're unable to treat and encouraged to become serial killers. And we have sex offenders. This is an issue particularly important to me, and where I most strongly believe in the punitive role of prisons. Approximately 15% of the entire prison population has committed a sexual offence, and that's excluding the 50,000 more people on the sex offenders list. 10% of released sex offenders go on to commit further sexual offences. A large component of sex offenders' mindsets is a power element within the committing of that offence, and that is supported by the reoffending rate. It's not something that can simply be rehabilitated out of an individual. How can it be just to claim to have rehabilitated a rapist or a paedophile within a relatively short period of time and force a victim to live with the knowledge that the individual who robbed them of their bodily autonomy and often more walks free after a stint in prison that simply focused on rehabilitation rather than public safety or justice? It cannot. The conviction rates for these types of offences are already incredibly low. Just 5.7% of reported rape cases result in a successful conviction in England and Wales, which is far lower than any other crime. Just 15% of victims even report those crimes, meaning less than 1% of total rapists end up with a criminal conviction. How can any of us look a victim in the face and tell them that we in fact support reducing the already slim chance of justice they might achieve by rehabilitating the perpetrator and letting them loose on society again? This same argument, of course, applies to other serious crimes, such as murder, where in that case it's the family of victims we would have to face rather than the victims themselves, as in most sexual offences and crimes involving bodily harm that doesn't result in death. I recognise that I've taken a particularly hard line and sombre approach to this issue, but unfortunately this is a reality we must all face. The issue of prisons simply having the role of rehabilitation cannot be allowed to gain any more traction than it already has, when they are so desperately needed not only for our safety, but to ensure at least some modicum of justice for the victims of many different offences. I urge you to vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Sean, and for its conciseness. We have a general question first. Please all send your messages to the Zoom chat. And as I've said on there, please, if possible, direct them specifically to someone or a specific side. Otherwise, I may end up asking the wrong person. I think this question is general, but maybe the proposition can start with it, since they're sort of the ones really proposing the motion. To what extent is answering the question about the role of prisons unanswerable without clarifying what we mean by justice, assuming that prisons as part of the justice system are aimed at maximising a sort of nebulous justice quantity?
Yes, so I believe that to some extent I did answer that at the start of my speech when I had to rattle through it quite quickly, so maybe I can explain it a bit better now. But when we think about what our criminal justice system is fundamentally aimed at, the idea of justice is achieving a social equilibrium in an ideal society where all members are well integrated members of our society that provide a good social function. And it was my argument that prisons should promote this by nature of being part of that criminal justice system. So I think justice in this context is working towards that ideal scenario where we have prisoners that stop being criminals having experience with the prison system. And by the best way to do that, it is argued, is through a rehabilitative approach rather than a retributionist or punitive approach, which, as I tried to outline quite quickly, the data is fully in support of. When you have harsh prison conditions, the reoffending rates and prisoner satisfaction rates are dreadful. And that's born out of the fact that you breed resentment in prisoners when you don't treat them as capacitous adults and try to encourage their life chances and opportunities, because it fundamentally comes down to the fact that prisoners are still humans, and that they still have these things that they want to do, and we should encourage that.
Thank you, Jack. I'm just going to ask, can I ask all panelists just to keep their points, their answers to questions about 1 minute at max, if possible.
Noted.
Next question to Sean. Do you not believe that leaving criminals alone and not reintegrating them into society is rather dangerous?
I mean, yes and no. I think that kind of links to another question someone asked about like whether or not it applies to everyone. I mean, absolutely. If you believe in rehabilitation for victimless crimes, or even some murderers, some rapists, some terrorists, then as sort of Jake argued, prisons aren't the most conducive to that. For certain individuals, unfortunately, whether they have, for example, serious mental health conditions that we simply cannot treat, so certain serial killers, for example, then they basically shouldn't be reintegrated in society. That's the problem. And the other thing I mentioned about sort of improving standards and conditions within prisons, that is conducive to lower reoffending rates. Ola mentioned the Norwegian model. That is kind of a massive element of that Norwegian model. And the former director of the prison service, who I mentioned, opposes the idea of prisons having rehabilitation whilst also supporting increased standards of living so that there is a lower reoffending. So it really depends basically on whether or not they are going to be reintegrated. So if they have a life sentence without parole, then the odds of them ever being let out and being reintegrated is irrelevant, because it's not going to happen.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I know there's a lot of questions sort of aimed at you, and I think there is just another one before we go to other people. And this was one about, is there a way to draw a line between those you can save and those you can't, which I think is sort of similar to what you've been talking about already.
I guess, yeah, so for kind of victimless offences, obviously I'd say that's quite easy. And if it is a victimless offence, then the sort of social implications aren't as bad to begin with. I mean, I'd obviously sort of encourage kind of mental health institutions, for example, to get involved. There needs to be far greater involvement of mental health services to help determine sort of what issues are, for example, because obviously a lot of, especially sort of serial killers, have underlying issues that need to be dealt with. And Mary's idea about the fact, Mark Leach's, the former prison's idea about how you cannot simply just sort of fix often long-term issues coming from childhood within a couple of months through some kind of rehabilitation course, for example, then there's a line again there. It's obviously a very case-by-case basis, so there isn't one uniform kind of process.
Unfortunately, most of the questions are aimed largely, I think, to you, Sean. And until there are further questions aimed at anyone else, I'll just ask the one about what about over-criminalisation of BAME people and marginalised people who are already marginalised? Which side would you argue is better for these people? Do you think that perhaps your idea of locking up serious sort of offenders could pose a problem to this? And I'll come to you. Oh, do you want to answer that first, Jack?
Yeah, please, if you don't mind, because I think what you've drawn on there is a fundamental reality. So while the opposition is talking about abolish prisons, abolish this, abolish, prisons are bad, we agree prisons are bad, and that is what the argument is that we can work to a better ideal of what prison is. But Natasha's exactly right. We do have a massive overrepresentation of BME people in prisons, and that is a reality that we have to deal with, and that is the situation that we have to approach. And what the opposition proposes in response to us is that we should treat those prisoners with a retributionist, punitive standpoint, and we shouldn't aim to rehabilitate them, and that should not be the aim of prison and their experience, which, as you say, further entrenches this over-criminalisation. Yet when you approach with a rehabilitative standpoint, you're treating them as the people that they are, and you are improving their life chances when they exit prison.
Okay, thanks for that, Jack. Jake, you want to say something on this? Yes.
Yeah, so that's not what we're saying. We are saying, well, firstly, the best way to deal with over-criminalisation of ethnic minorities is to not arrest ethnic minorities for no reason. But besides that, we're obviously not saying that criminals shouldn't be rehabilitated, because the entire argument is that prisons are bad for rehabilitation. And we're saying that ethnic minorities are overrepresented in prison, and they shouldn't be. They should be rehabilitated on the outside, where they can still work in the jobs that they currently have, where they still have all of the positive social connections, such as their families, which actually helps them be rehabilitated due to positive peer pressure and being part and enfranchised within society. When you lock people up, it impacts drastically the ability to rehabilitate people. And so putting them in prison and saying, oh, crime is bad, doesn't really do anything. And that's the way to address it, is to keep them enfranchised in society. But I also want to come on to the point that it's a massive issue in terms of the generational deficit. So the generational deficit is this idea where marginalized groups generationally become more poor and more impoverished because of the lack of life opportunities of the parents within that group. And when ethnic minorities are locked up in prison, they're not earning money, so their families are poorer, right? And that's inherent. When they're released from prison, they get £46, but until with the assumption that they will then move on to benefits. That's the official line on the government website. You get £46 until your next benefit payment. And so locking these people up makes their families poorer, which makes their children poorer, which makes the children more likely to commit crime, because there is a link between crime rates and poverty. So don't lock them up.
Thank you for that, Jake. There's another question. I think this is quite a broad one, but this is one: should prisoners / criminals be able to vote? And I guess that comes to those who are arguing for rehabilitation. Jack.
So it quite fundamentally is a question of human rights, and this question has been answered already. Under European Convention of Human Rights, you have a right to participate in free and fair elections. The European Court on Human Rights has found previously, in the last 10 years, that the ban on prisoner voting is a breach of human rights. And I really argue that, in line with a rehabilitative approach, where you have a prisoner who is showing quite clear signs of significant improvement in behaviour and significant advancement through the prison system, then it is a fundamental deprivation of a democratic human right that they have to say that they should not be able to vote. Of course, the question's been answered for us already, is that in line with the human rights we have chosen to imbue our population with, criminals and prisoners should be able to have the vote.
Thank you for that, Jack. Ola, did you want to say anything on that point as well?
No, I had the pretty much same instinct as Jack to refer to the European Convention on Human Rights. So, yeah.
Brilliant. And I think there is another question for Sean, or a point to him, because he mentioned, of course, the issue around sex offenders and them being serious criminals to the point who need to remain in prison. And Teresa has pointed out that sex offenders are actually one of the least likely to reoffend. 13.5% reoffend on average, compared to an average of 74% of burglars. Sean, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely a fair point. I think the difference with burglars and sex offenders is that a lot of the time burglars and kind of criminals in terms of like theft, for example, the reason they're doing that is often because of kind of socioeconomic circumstances. So a burglar will often be in poverty, therefore end up robbing a place to make money. And then if they come out of prison, as Jake mentioned, without having the opportunity to make more money, they're going to end up doing the same thing again and again and again. The difference with a sex offender is that there is no financial incentive there. That is a purely personal power kind of thing. And that means that that kind of 10 to 13.5%, as Theresa said, who do reoffend, it's not about something that you can remedy as a government, as a society, about their kind of socioeconomic conditions. It's about that very individual and about their very mindset, which means that if that 10% is constantly reoffending, and that is a regular number no matter what government we have, then they can't be rehabilitated.
Thank you for that, Sean. Jake, you want to come in on this? Yes.
What was the question?
Well, you had your hand up, so I assumed you.
Oh, that was for prisoner voting.
Do you want to? Well, you can. Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Go on to that point.
So the proposition talked about human rights. My man Ken Clark, one of the best Tories, most of them are bad, but Ken Clark's an icon. He talked about prisoners having the vote in a very basic sense, which was the government derelicts their duty to treat prisoners fairly because they can't vote and they want to save money on prisons, and so they take the prisoners' voices away to protest with their vote about how they're treated. And so regardless of human rights, that's an aspect, but on a very practical level, prisoners should of course have the vote, but also they shouldn't be locked up anyway for minor things, so they should have the vote on the outside. But if we do incarcerate a bunch of people, of course they should have the vote, just for a practical purpose. It stops the government ignoring them.
Well, I don't believe there was any more questions specifically, or a lot of them are dealing with the answers and all the questions we've already had. So on that note, we'll move to a vote, although unless someone has suddenly, oh no. So let's move to a vote if possible. And we'll.
I can see a question that I'd quite like to answer.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I may have missed one. Do you mind reading out because I can't see it?
It's the one about should ex-offenders' job opportunities be protected?
So, yeah.
So I think absolutely, and the government does that to a very small extent. So when you're leaving prison, you might get a job at Pound World on minimum wage or something like that. There's a very select few massive corporations who work with the government to provide some low-skill, low-wage jobs to prisoners, which isn't useful is not useful work experience. It sets them behind their peers within the same age group because they're de-skilled. And when you're de-skilled, you have less opportunity to get the jobs that potentially these people actually had before they were locked up. Because when you're sent into prison, you lose your job, right? My model of rehabilitation would allow people to keep in their jobs, to keep the jobs that they already have in the sectors that they're good at, and the work experience would keep being accrued and they wouldn't lose and fall behind everybody else. And again, they're given £46 when they leave. And another aspect, when you're locked up in prison, you have to declare on every future job application your crime for being in prison. In my model, you wouldn't have to do that. Of course, serious offences where you're a threat to your co-workers should have to be declared. But minor crimes, smoking a spliff when you're 21 and getting caught, should not have to be declared. And my model would do that. Their model wouldn't.
Thanks, Jake. I just want to move to Jack. Jack wanted to make a point on this.
Yeah. Casting Jake's bold assumption aside at the end there, there's an annual prison review that's conducted by HMPPS every year, and the most recent one found that 25 out of 35 prisons were requiring improvement or inadequate in effectiveness of providing education, skills and work opportunities. No prison was outstanding. So what we have is a clear failure in the prison system at the moment to provide those core opportunities that, as you say, do protect those job opportunities. In fact, 3/4 of prisons fail to use all of their activity places. So people are left without work, education and training, which addresses that deficit that Jake has just described when people leave prison. So if done properly, the framework is there to rehabilitate people so that when they leave prison, they can take up those jobs. And again, as I put in the chat earlier, I refer you to Ugan and Blarnick's study in 2016. It's a really, really good criminological paper. And they review a 1970s scheme where jobs were given to those leaving custody and compared it to a sample group of those that weren't in the scheme. And the reoffending rates of those that participated in the scheme meant there was a 46% reduction in reoffending. So as you say, my answer to that is quite simply, yes, you should preserve the job opportunities because the data is abundant that when you do that, you reduce reoffending and you end up with what I described in the beginning, which is you have a criminal justice system that is serving its goal start to finish, and you end up with people who have gone from a path of criminality to a point now where they are well integrated social actors.
Thank you for that, Jack. Okay, Jake has one more response. I don't want it to become too much to and fro. Jake, briefly.
I mean, I just need to point out, as Jack says, prisoners having jobs and having an economic incentive not to commit crime prevents them from committing crime. So instead of locking them up and forcing them to get another job, which is probably lower paid than they originally had, just let them keep their original job. And then that's more of an incentive for them not to commit crime. That's what the stats actually back as a model. Giving jobs to prisoners when they leave goes part way, not the whole way. Mine would.
Thank you for that. And on that note, I think we will call it an end unless someone is going to try and push another question. Thank you everyone for your questions today. Obviously, this is a very important topic. We are now going to come to a final vote, as Sean has reminded me constantly, though I did realize we had a final vote. So let's do the final vote. Those in favor of the motion, this House believes the role of prisons is rehabilitation. Please, can you react with a thumbs up now? Okay, and those against? And finally, those in abstention. Okay, brilliant. Well, of course, we did have an increase of people joining us after the first vote. The first vote saw 5 in favour and 3 against, and now we've had 5 in favour, the same, but 2 against. So there's been a drop by 1, but we've got 2 abstentions. So in fact, the debate has been moved more into abstention than anything. But well done to everyone in this debate. Of course, I should note that not everyone not every speaker was 100% in agreement with what they were arguing for. They did it out of the need for a speaker in the debate. If you're interested in debating, please do contact our page and get in touch so you can join us for our debates next term. It would be great to have you debate. Thank you everyone for joining us, and good night.